Is it wrong to have doubts about God? The psalmists questioned God about the unfairness of life. They arrived at their answers based on observation of God's creation and his self-revelation in word and deed. They believed the evidence. Is there anything wrong with questioning what we have been taught to believe about God and Christianity? If it is true, will it stand up to scrutiny? Should we look to the evidence? Or should we let our feelings and cultural pressures apart from the Bible be the gauge for determining what is Christian and what is not? Thank you for joining our discussion about the deconstruction of Christianity.
And welcome as we begin tonight again on the, not that we're deconstructing Christianity, but we're discussing the deconstruction of Christianity. Boy, I'm glad I caught that one before I said it out loud. That's too weird. And I'm Don Veinot, president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois. And Dr. Donald Williams is along to keep me in line, hopefully, or to at least to the best of his ability. And then the rest of the crew, James Lopez, who's, you have some position with EM&R. Oh, yeah, executive director of EM&R. And you've been with me a really long time as well. Was it 25 years?
25, 26, around there.
Yeah, something like that.
Possibly.
And you still like me, which is a
and
good
I still
thing.
like you. I'm still hanging around. Yeah.
And our caffeinated Colorado crew.
Woohoo!
They're great. We're glad. Jeff won't be with us tonight. He's at a Jewish Bible study, so that'll be Messianic Jewish Bible study.
Okay. He's studying Jew.
Kind of get that right. So I spent a little time this week while I was reading through the chapter. I didn't get all the way through the chapter because I got too irritated as I was doing my research. I was watching some of the videos of deconstructors.
Yeah.
And I had mixed feelings, I have to admit. On the one hand, I felt infuriated about the claims they were making. And then, as it occurred to me, it's probably unfair to have that feeling because in many cases they were not well taught in whatever environment, church, family, both maybe. In some cases, it is that they had good churches and parents attempting to teach, but they were basically ignoring them. Or it could be that they're just in a stage of rebellion, which all of us go through at some point. And so I had to kind of rewind my whole thinking on that. And remember that my task, is to as kindly as possible discuss the issues. The battle is between them and God, ultimately. It's not between them and me or them and you or them and the church. It's between them and God, ultimately, I think. But Lisa Childers and Tim Barnett start off this section with this. From the perspective of deconstructionists, there is no false theology to be corrected. I thought that was interesting. There is only toxic theology to be constructed. Are some parents, friends, or even church leaders concerned? The obvious answer is yes. But are they concerned about the loss of power or the spiritual well-being of someone? See, that's a question that it really comes down to, is because there's an idea somehow that the whole object of the church and of parents that are trying to raise their children in the faith is one of control, not of spiritual well-being.
Right.
So it makes it difficult to have a conversation on these issues because we're starting at diametrically opposing ideas. We have different definitions even for the world. It's like I've had some, as you might guess, on occasion, although we don't talk about it very much on our webcast or hardly ever in our written material, I do occasionally have discussions about politics with individuals. I like discussing politics, actually. And I make a point that we sometimes make a mistake between liberals progressives and conservatives. And here's what I mean by that. Liberals, by and large, still hold an essentially similar worldview to conservatives. We see the same basic problems, but we have different solutions, radically different solutions for those problems. Progressives do not even see the same problems. So we're not carrying on the same conversation. We're talking different languages. It's kind of like, I was in construction for 40 years. I've mentioned that. And I had the opportunity to work with a lot of different people from different countries for a variety of reasons. And it's always interesting to watch someone, let's say, from Poland and someone from, I don't know, a Hispanic country arguing with each other in languages that they don't understand.
Oh, that must be fun.
And in order to get their points across, they yell louder, as though somehow loudness makes the fact that they don't speak the same language is mitigated and they can now understand each other. It doesn't really work that way. So I would suggest we have the same kind of a thing going on here. Is we're not even talking the same language. You don't have the same starting point. And so in the view of those who are deconstructing, the church is about power, not about spiritual well-being. So to a deconstructionist, the abuser would say this. The abuser, what did I do? I lost my paper here. Oh yeah. They go on to give an example in the book from a TikTok video by someone they call themselves Shaley Cult Slayer. That was viewed 900,000 times by the time this book was written. And Shaley plays the part of herself and of the Christian. And it goes like this. The deconstructionist, the abuser tells a story. The abuser, and this is Shaley, she's playing both parts. The abuser will break down the victim's self-worth and self-esteem and make them feel broken and worthless without them, so they are dependent on the abuser. Now, is that true how abusers work? Well, the answer is yes, that is how the abusers work. And then she becomes a Christian and goes, oh yeah, that's really horrible that people do that. Then she takes the next part and says, right? So then when a church teaches you that you're born broken and a sinner and worthy of eternal punishment, it's ... Back to the Christian. True, we're all sinners that Jesus died for us. She goes on. Deconstructionist, I'm going to start from the beginning. That you know where, and let me know where I lost you. Now that's interesting, because what has she just done here?
She sort of laid out, according to her, that this is the whole reason of this toxicity coming from the church. That it's all about control. That you're worthless. That they're trying to demean you. That they're not looking out for your best interest at all.
Right. So you're an abuser. That is the essential premise. The church is an abuser. The Bible is an abusive book. The individuals who believe the Bible are abusers. So everything is about abuse. And when they're trying to set this up, what they've done is set up, all of us here should know what this is. A false dilemma.
Yeah.
It's a false dilemma. What's a false dilemma? Anybody?
Not all at once.
You give
Pardon?
two options as if they are the only two options, and you've left out a third option. And because option A is intolerable, you have to choose option B, and you don't realize that C even exists because you've conveniently left that out of your presentation. In fact, they haven't just left it out in the dialogue we just read. they have deliberately excluded it.
Yes.
Right. Right. And so, unless you're paying attention, you're sort of tricked into thinking that it's either their abuser or they're not an abuser, but that's not even what's going on there,
Mm-hmm.
because they've given you a false dilemma. They've compared two opposing things, actually. Now, my dad used to do something kind of like that. He would ask me sometimes, would you rather walk to school or carry your lunch? They're not connected,
No. No. Not an either or kind of thing.
right? One has to do with how I'm going to get to school. The other one is how am I going to how am I going to get my lunch where I want it to be? They're not connected even. But I was too young to know any better, and I was always puzzled by that. This is kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the false dilemma? The video sets up a false dilemma that kind of goes like this. Oh my!
Well,
Oh my! I hate it when that happens. Oh, there it is. I have too many windows open.
Uh-oh.
Think of it this way. Imagine a scenario in which someone recognizes that particular person is broken. So we have a person who's broken. That's the scenario. And then proceeds to beat on that individual's chest forcefully, causing deep bruising. Is that just their toxic way of trying to control the other person or beat them into submission? So there's the scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Many would call it abuse. We would too, unless the person pounding on the other's chest is trained in CPR and the chest they are pounding on lodges a heart that is stopped beating. Right? So who's doing the quote beating? What is the purpose of the beating? Are they qualified to do the beating in this case here to bring them back to life? So the broken person has a heart that has stopped. It would be correct to try to bring it back, or they could just say, "Oh gosh, he had a heart attack. Too bad for him."
Right. That changes everything. The whole scenario.
Right. So the person will die without intervention, and the person performing the chest compressions is actually saving their life.
Mm-hmm.
However, if someone were to tell a perfectly healthy person they were broken, and then proceed to pound on their chest cavity, an observer would call that. An observer wouldn't call the hospital first, but rather the police. I think that is correct.
Mm-hmm.
To refer to original sin as toxic makes sense only if it's not true. So there's the question. Is it true that we are, however you want to define original sin, at the very least, if we're born with a sin nature, that is sufficient because we sin like almost immediately anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not even going to kind of discuss the whole situation of what exactly is original sin, but we have an original sinner, and we're his offspring, his and her offspring, and we sin as a result of carrying that on. That is our nature now.
Right.
Is that fair and sort of safe there, Don?
Yeah, I think so. A and B are A, you don't believe in original sin. B, you believe in it and you're an abuser.
Mm-hmm.
C, you believe in it and you're actually trying to help point people to the solution.
Right.
And of course, C is what gets left out. And you can kind of tell. I mean, B exists. I mean, people certainly do use the doctrine of original sin to abuse and control people,
Right.
and destroy them. Here's how you can tell. Does the person apply the doctrine of original sin to himself first
Mm-hmm.
before he applies it to you?
That's important.
That's a good sign that you may be dealing with somebody who's actually going to help you. Otherwise, run screaming from the room.
Yeah, and there's a kind of a misunderstanding here, and I would
Right.
suggest it is because their standard of measurement is wrong.
Mm.
Right? The videos I was watching, I kept seeing this happen over and over, and I remember talking to others all down through the years as I would talk to them about our status before God, and they
Mm-hmm.
invariably would say something like, "Well, I'm not that bad."
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a relative sense, that's true. I mean, you may not be as bad as, I don't know, John Wayne Gacy, for example, for those who are old enough to remember who that is, even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? But that doesn't mean your measuring stick is off. That's the problem. If you raise your measuring standard, you would not really fit. So saying I'm better than my next door neighbor down the street even might be true, but that's kind of like saying I can bench press way more than my grandmother. It's true, but it's meaningless.
Yeah.
Right?
The whole premise is wrong.
Right. So this is the same kind of a situation. So does original sin teach that humans are worthless? See, there's the rub, because that's what they're saying is, I have worth. It is terrible to say I have original sin because I have worth. So they have mistaken the idea of original sin to mean I am a worthless person, right?
Right.
The answer is no. Why is it that we're not worthless?
Quite the opposite, right? Because we are made in the image of God.
Clearly, we value, or God wouldn't have sent Jesus to save us.
Right.
Well, we have intrinsic value in and of ourselves. We're not worthy.
Right.
Clearly, if you let Jesus be your standard and adopt his attitude, sinners are people who have value.
Right.
Right.
Does he love people radically, profoundly, and every single one of them was a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the whole idea that the doctrine of sin means people are worthless is simply a misreading of the scripture on the deepest level you can imagine.
Well, and that's even assuming they're reading the scripture. That's kind of the right. I think that's the problem with what we're talking about.
Sure.
There's assumptions that are made, and I want to be a little. I have to hold myself back here because it is very easy to blame churches or families, and it really isn't the churches or families. It's kind of like this. We just saw an attempted assassination of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, as soon as I realized he was fine, my next question was, how are the shooter's parents going to live with this?
Right. Mm-hmm.
They didn't do anything, but they're going to be suffering for this act of their son.
Mm-hmm.
And they love their son in spite of this act.
Mm-hmm.
Life is more complicated than all of that. And we don't have access, obviously, to all of the information at this point, and we may never have it. But it caused me to kind of step back a little bit and say, okay, how would I want my daughter and son-in-law to be treated if it had been my grandson that did that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they invest themselves in their kids. They tried to raise them properly. And in his case, the shooter's case, he apparently was not a sort of social favorite in the schools and those sorts of things. So now that doesn't give him license to do what he did. What he did was evil, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure exactly why I went in that direction. We're kind of back to the measuring standard.
Right.
How we measure things as being right and wrong. And we can elevate ourselves as saying something is I have more worth than somebody else. Well, that's not really true. We are created in the image of God. We have inherited a sin nature, and we choose to sin. Christ provided the remedy and freely uh, offers it to us. And
Hmm.
we tend to miss this. And for some reason, those who are in the process of being deconstructors, either they don't realize this, they never heard this, or they have invented a new fantasy about the faith for other reasons.
Hmm.
So there's
One,
lots. Yeah.
and this whole idea of toxic, it's a false premise to begin with. I mean, Oxford Dictionary defines toxic as one, poisonous. Well, I've never known anybody who's died or gone to the hospital from an excess of Jesus. Um, Number two, very harmful or unpleasant in a pervasive or insidious way. Well, if that's what you're getting out of your Christianity, you're doing Christianity wrong, or your church is. But the problem isn't with Jesus. The problem is with you or your church.
Right.
So this whole thing is a false premise.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
it's just word games being used. Most people don't bother to look up definitions or stop and think, how does toxic apply to it? You know, other games like homophobia.
Yeah.
Never run screaming away from a gay person before in my entire life. That's what homophobia would actually be. But
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
you got to look for the word games and
Yeah.
avoid it.
It is used to validate anything they want.
Sure.
So
Sure. Yeah, and you can go even further to say that they have a choice. They don't have to, go with it. They don't have to accept it. You don't want to be a Christian? Don't be a Christian. Nobody's forcing them.
Right.
But they choose to do the opposite, not only they don't just retreat and say, okay, well, I'm not a Christian and that's it. But they tend to attack it for others not to be a part of it.
Right. They become evangelistic for their newfound
Right.
faith because it is a faith.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even that, I mean, they're welcome. We welcome them to do that.
Sure. They have that right and freedom.
But that
And I,
doesn't.
oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. And I think they don't fully understand. They don't grasp it. You know, so they attack it in order for them to feel like justified, like, oh, this is what it is, because they want to feel good, you know, instead of following what the Bible actually says.
Part of it, yeah.
Sure. Let's ask a couple of questions as we go through this. As I think about the different people that we've dealt with over the years. In fact, we just had a conversation with one in Ireland Saturday. Is it, if they say I was in a very abusive church situation, and they may well be, does that mean Christianity is untrue?
Negative.
No, it doesn't. And that is a dilemma, because their only real understanding of Christianity was in an abusive environment, say like, a Bill Gothard kind of a church.
Mm-hmm.
But even there are some really wonderful parents raising kids in Gothardism because they were afraid of what would happen to their kids if they hadn't been properly taught. And they had a more balanced view, so they grew up pretty well. Others did not.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the dilemma of the parents and the system they're in, not Christianity.
Right.
Right. So we have to kind of make a separation between that.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, is there are many churches where the leadership would gladly sit down and work through these issues if they knew they existed.
Right.
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 So that's where, like, apologists like myself have to be careful, because the assumption is the church didn't care. I know too many pastors and elders who do care,
Mm-hmm.
who would gladly take the time to sit down, drink a Coke or whatever it is that they want to partake of, have a pizza. I've seen many youth pastors do that kind of a thing. In fact, I have an associate that was a Jehovah's Witness, raised Jehovah's Witness. His friend was a Christian. They were in high school, I think, high school, yeah. And they were arguing over doctrine in class even.
Mm.
And so the young his Christian friend said, would you like to meet with my youth pastor? And he said, oh yeah. And so he went home and he was, getting all ready. He had visions of converting the youth pastor and then the whole church and then the whole denomination. And he walks in and they sit down to talk, and he starts rolling off at everything. And the youth pastor looked at him and said, are you a Jehovah's Witness? He said, well, yeah, how do you know? He goes, well, they kind of have a problem with the Trinity. And he goes, a problem with the Trinity? Who wouldn't have a problem with the Trinity? Now, the youth pastor did something really unique. They met once a week, had pizza, went through scripture, talked about the issues he was having. The youth pastor answered the issues well. He ended up becoming a believer. But it meant someone was available to take the time to walk them through the questions they had.
Yes.
Now, I compare that with others who had those kinds of questions and went to the pastoral staff and were kind of, said, just take it by faith.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of what we're dealing here. And you have others, and Krista and I have talked about this with their family, have been in churches where they have false teaching in the church, and they've gone to them and basically invited to go away.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard because you want the church to be a protected place. So all of those things are going on, and we don't know when we're talking to someone who's deconstructing the faith what their actual background is.
Mm-hmm.
So question one, and we've always talked about this, every time we talk about talking to someone that's in another faith, where do you start? Anybody, where do you start?
Oh,
Questions.
go ahead. Questions, yeah. Yeah. What kind? What would be
Right.
maybe
What do you mean?
right? Defining the verbiage or the
Right. First, define your terms.
Mhm.
Their beliefs. I'm sorry.
Right.
A lot of headaches, and then pick up from there.
Mhm.
yeah.
Right. You really can't go anywhere. There's this. We watch it all the time, where you get boned up with the arguments for why Christianity is true, and you go armed for bear to sort of beat them into submission with the biblical arguments,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they're leaving because their mother passed away, and they're in grief, and no one cared.
Right.
Right? I have a friend down the street here, a couple of houses down.
Mm-hmm.
Really like him. He tells me, he says, I'm an atheist. I go, no, you're not an atheist. You're an agnostic, maybe. You're too smart to be an atheist. What do you mean, too smart to be an atheist? Well, being an atheist is to claim to know something you can't know. You can't know God doesn't exist. And you're just not that arrogant, I don't think. So you could be an agnostic, though, and let's work with that.
Yeah.
Right. And as I talk to him, and I discover that when he was a young boy, and they moved here, he's from another country, and his parents were getting divorced, the church cut them off
Mm.
because of the divorce.
Sure.
So his view of the church is they're just power hungry and in it for the money.
Heartless. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to, our task is kind of to answer the questions that he has, talk them through, give him time, because ultimately the Holy Spirit is the one who does the convicting and convincing.
Right.
We're just message bearers is all we are.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So the destructor doesn't consider the question of whether the being born with sin nature is true, but instead assumes motive. It assumes motive.
Right.
We all have to be careful of assuming motive from any end.
Mm-hmm.
Not what the church is doing and not what they're deconstructing. We need to figure out, and for those who are listening going, where do I start? Here's where you start, in my opinion. Read Gray Kuchel's book, Tactics. It's not talking about theology. It is only talking about the process of how do you talk to somebody who's in this kind of a situation. right? So that's a very helpful tool. As when we went through it, I kept saying, it's like he followed me around because that's how
Right.
he's always done this.
Yeah. Exactly. Lots of questions.
Lots of questions, and questions are fun.
Yeah.
As they answer the questions, they give you the direction that you need to go to ask the next question, to get to the place of sharing whatever it is that you have to tell them.
Mhm.
We live in an age where truth is based on an individual's feelings. This is really an important aspect.
Mhm.
One of the core claims of CRT, critical race theory advocates, is that truth is my lived experience.
Mhm.
Right. So you don't have to learn math, and you don't have to learn science, you don't have to learn social studies. You just have to understand that I have my experience, which then tells me what is true.
Mm.
Could your experience, your feelings mislead you?
Mm-hmm.
Very much so.
Yeah, emotional reasoning.
Yeah.
It's not about what you feel, it's about what you know. But if what you know is completely based off of your experience, you can't say that's true for everybody. So that's where we get into the truth dilemma.
Mhm.
Right.
Yep.
Right. 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 And we have talked about that before. We'll talk about that again as time goes on, because just because there is relative truth in the sense that some things are relative to you, and it's true that they're relative to you. It's true that I'm wearing a brown shirt tonight with shiny stripes in it, and my wife bought it for me. She dresses me very well. That's true on July 16th at 2:24 at 8:32 p.m. Central Time. I'm wearing this color shirt, and that's going to be absolutely true for all of eternity.
Yep.
Now, it may also be true that Don's wearing, I don't know, a checkered shirt of some kind or something. So,
That's not true.
Checker to me.
well, I can't quite see it. It's all my
Oh.
eyes are fuzzy here. So
Oh, it's kind of like a very light green. Oh,
whatever. I don't care what shirt he's wearing. It's different than mine.
Yeah.
So it's relative to him that he's wearing that, but it's absolutely true that both of us are wearing whatever shirt it is that we're wearing right now. So absolute truth is what is important in this kind of a discussion.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I heard a pastor once say that the most powerful truth is the truth that you experience. And I was just like,
Yeah.
obviously that can't be the most powerful, because not the most powerful everybody would be able to understand that. That would be only the most powerful for you. So absolute truth, it's critical. It is so incredibly important. I'll be honest, reading this chapter it got really tedious. It's like, am I the only one here who is and it's nice to know, Dawn, that you had a hard time reading this chapter as well, maybe for different reasons. But it's basically the same thing. It's a battle against truth. It's this resistance and it's pride with a lot of hurt, and people just want to be happy. They just want to be good, but you don't want to deal with the flip side of that coin, and there is always a flip side.
Right.
Always a flip side. So it's just hard, because it seems like it's the same dilemma through all of these chapters, and it really is. It's a battle for truth. But it's just a different grievance that we're going to pick on and talk about for each one. So.
Well, it kind of is. Now, something you just brought up, I think, is important, because what we're seeing is something that we see happen recurringly, but that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, which is, I got to turn my light on here. Romans 1.
Which verse?
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress what? The truth. For what they can know about God is plain to them. In other words, they can see it, they can work around, you have to answer the question of where did everything come from. I was just reading about that today on something Richard Dawkins had written. And he looks around and he admits that everything appears to have design, and that proves that it's not design. Okay. For what we can know about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in all the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For all that they know God, they did not honor him as God, but gave themselves to give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they knew about God, they turned to worship images like man.
Hmm.
And I was started to write a blog article on this. I set it to the side, but I may revisit it because it kind of reminds me of the Roman Empire. What sort of gods and goddesses did they have?
Right. The emperors themselves were.
Right. It was a god that looked just like them.
Right. Yeah. And the Greek gods too, they were all.
Right. They adopted the Greek gods, and then they my Bibled it and created whatever they want. And
Right.
the altar of the unknown God,
Even that.
Even
Right.
that. So.
Right. So we're seeing the same kind of a theme here, is that even though they are aware of what the truth is, they reject it for some other reason. They don't like God.
They don't want it. Mm-hmm.
For their own reasons that they believe give them the opportunity then to walk away from God. And certainly they have that opportunity.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that walk away is good. It is going to be harmful for them, ultimately.
Yeah.
But we live in an age of relativism, and they quote Greg Kuchel on this point. Remember, relativism is the ultimate negation of truth,
Mm-hmm.
and when truth dies, power is all that remains. We around here have had a lot of discussions over the last few years, politically inclined largely,
Mm-hmm.
on what is it that we as a nation are looking to achieve. Either we have a democratic republic, which is the best parts of democracy and republic. They didn't want a democracy,
No.
and they didn't want a republic because there's bad stuff that goes with both of them. So they wanted the best of both, and they kind of put them together. The other option, which is the one that seems to be growing currently, is more of a mobocracy, which is what democracy is. It's a mobocracy.
Right.
And whatever mob is in control determines the
outcome.
how do we live, right, wrong. It's not right.
Mm-hmm.
It's tied to the mob. It's not tied to anything outside of the mob.
Mm-hmm. And the individual right is gone. Go ahead, John.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, critical theory assumes that Christianity and evangelicalism, in particular, are shaped by oppressive ideologies like white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, and Christian nationalism. In fact, you just read an article today. I'm going to have it in the crux this week. That archaeology is racist.
Oh yeah.
You have racist dinosaurs and racist rocks.
Wow.
And there are other worlds that we could imagine, but we have no evidence for it because it's racist. Now,
amazes me.
When everything is shaped by that idea, you can't really get to the truth of things.
Right.
So doctrines like sin, hell, and separation from God in this idea are made up in order to oppress and control people.
Mm. Yeah.
So that's kind of what they're doing, and they're moving toward. Um, Progressive David Gushee, he's an interesting kind of a guy. Uh, he and others are on a crusade to move evangelicals away from theology.
Yeah.
Now, if you move Christianity away from evangelicals, away from theology, what do you have?
Right. You can't call it Christianity anymore.
Well,
Yeah,
no
you really
longer
can't.
that,
I mean, you can, but it's not.
but it's not
Right.
exactly.
Right? You can
Yeah.
call it whatever you want, but that doesn't make it what it is.
Right.
It's a
The flip
fake.
side of that is paganism, right?
Yeah.
Create your own God. You create your own.
So if you try to move away from theology, what you end up with is bad theology.
Yeah.
Because you can't move away from theology. Because if I ask you, well, why shouldn't we have theology, and you try to answer that question, you'll be doing theology.
Regardless, yeah.
So you don't have an option to have theology or not. You have an option to have theology that is faithful or not, that's well thought out or not,
Mhm.
that is correct or not. So yeah, move away from theology. You're going to have bad theology, and if it's bad enough, it won't be Christian at all anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I also happen to notice one thing. These same people who complain about Christian theology as being patriarchal and oppressive, violent, racist, well, these words all describe Islam, but somehow they don't have these issues with Islam.
Right.
Why isn't that? How come they're not out protesting outside the mosque or trying to get Muslims to deconstruct?
They won't live very long.
Yeah.
Well, Islam is not the religious system that, in their mind, oppressed them.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So it's a very, very personal reaction, and
Yeah.
you know, you don't know what it comes from. It's too simplistic to say, well, they had an abusive church, because it might or might not have been the church's fault. Sometimes it is,
Mm-hmm.
but people don't like. There are things about Christianity that the natural man doesn't like. They don't like the idea of grace. We don't like a salvation that we can't take any of the credit for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's ultimately why we object to original sin. Because if original sin is true, then we need grace. There's no other way out of that dilemma. They don't like the Christian sexual ethic.
Mm.
They don't like, the people naturally don't like these things. And you have to give them a reason why they should reconsider their natural objection to them.
Right.
And if we don't do that, they're eventually going to move away from it. They're going to find a way of believing that is more comfortable to the
Right.
natural man, and a lot of people are being honest enough to just say, "Well, we're not Christians anymore,"
Mm.
and
Josh Harris did that.
have
Right.
their cake and eat
Right.
it too.
Right.
Right. Right.
They're
Exactly.
trying to have their theological cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
Right. They kind of want to be Christianish.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what we call it, Christianish.
Maybe.
So I think about David Gushee and those others who are kind of trying to have a Christianity without theology. They define it by progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
Reminds me of a very sharp young scholar in 1923, Machen, who wrote Christianity and Liberalism.
Mm.
It is to me, it's classic, and I think every Christian should read it because he's basically saying, okay, here's what you want and here's what you claim. Here's what the Bible teaches. You may be religious, but you're not Christian.
Mm. There you go.
Right? Because you're rejecting fundamental teachings of what defines what you are. But there's something inherent in pretty much every religion. It isn't just those who are tangentially related to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
You might recall we have one of our little satirical ads is the good keeping Jesus seal of approval. Every religion has Jesus in some form or fashion, whether you're Islam, or Hindu, or Buddhist, or they all have Jesus in their schema somehow
Mm-hmm.
because it gives them some credibility for some reason.
Mm.
But they don't want to believe who he is or what he taught.
Right.
So, and you have that with David Gushee and the Deconstructors. They want to reject largely what Jesus taught. They like the idea of, feeding the poor. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good thing, and I think we should do it.
Sure.
And if you look back at the history of the church, which group are the ones who partook or stood up to feeding the poor, taking care of the sick, and so forth?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the Hindus. Wasn't
Yep.
the Muslims. It was the Christians.
Yep.
All down through history.
Yep.
And many of them are still doing it even though they're being assaulted by governments.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Christianity and liberalism is kind of where we're at in some senses with them, only farther.
Mm.
I've been talking to Carl Teichert about this and Steve Matthews, and we're at an unusual place in history because we were just talking about the Imago Dei. What is it that we see so many in today's culture trying to destroy?
Mm.
It's the image of God.
Yep.
Right? You see that come itself out with transgenderism, for example. We don't like the way we're made. We want to be a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to fix God's creation to match the creation we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Or transhumanism. We really don't like living as humans. We want to be able to upload ourselves into a computer program and exist eternally on a hard drive somewhere in the cloud. Abortion is another one, right? Because humans are of no value, right? And so abortion is okay because they're, well, wait a minute. What about the rights of the mother? Well, that's a question of, do humans have rights regardless of where they live? And do I have a right as a human to take the life of another human that I don't want to be in my space? That's really what it comes down to. If living within the boundaries of the female body makes you the property because it's her property that you're residing in.
Right.
And you, therefore, anything living within your property, you have the right to do with whatever you want. Then if someone is living within my house and I don't want them to be there anymore, do I have a right to just kill them? Well, no. Because their right to, as a human, their human rights supersede my rights to my convenience. I have a right, and Joy likes to do this one, to extend my hand straight out in front of my face. And my right ends just before it hits your nose. So I have a right to extend my hand, but I don't have a right to hit you in the nose. So they are in the process of trying to destroy the Imago Dei, the image of God, on humans.
Right.
and in the process, they're kind of destroying themselves, which is very difficult. Have Christians and Christian leadership behaved badly?
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's where it gets so murky because
Hmm.
you're rolling in, or excuse me, you're wading through murky waters, and you have to be very careful because there's real hurt there. But where you get entrapped in the hurt and the self-pity from a very valid traumatic experience or whatever, you have to learn how to separate the two, because if you don't, you can deconstruct completely, or you can end up just not believing in anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So here's a question that they pose on one of their headings, which I liked, is the heading is divinely revealed, not socially constructed. The gospel is not socially constructed; it is divinely revealed.
Big difference.
Right? It is a big difference. Someone want to look up 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 5.
1 Corinthians 15. One through 5.
Yeah.
All right. Yes, I got it. Okay. Want me to read it?
Yep.
Okay.
Out loud.
Yes. Now we're listening to God's word, right? Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Most of them are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. That's 6. Want me to keep going?
No, that's good, because what it tells us is, and this is something that's helpful in the origin,
Right.
is Paul received this. It was already being used and was extant prior to receiving it. It usually works that way. If you receive something, somebody else was already talking about it.
Yeah.
And we know about when he received it. And as we start working backwards, what we discover, Gary Habermas did some really good work on this, that it would have been in use within 3 to 5 years of the actual resurrection event itself. It was an early church creed taught to the early believers. This is what we believe about the resurrection. And then it was passed on from there. So it's very early, written by eyewitnesses, and passed on. So there's strong evidence for the resurrection. We know what they believed, and we know what they taught about salvation. Now we have pseudo history. I haven't read through everything because I had something up here blocking and I couldn't read it. But and we're not going to be able to answer it today. Oh yeah, maybe we can. So he's going through. I can put this up. We can look at it and then see if we want to speak to it. First one he had was no one really wants to know who Jesus, the man behind the myth. 2. Oh, and then they quote the birth narrative, but then they pose a kind of a weird question. We have seen, okay. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. For we have seen a star from the east, and now come to worship him. When Herod had heard these things, he was troubled, and all of Israel with him. There's only one reason why Jesus would need sanctuary in Egypt from Herod, the Great, and not because he was the Son of God. I'm not sure where he's going with this exactly. Matthew was Herod's tax collector, and Herod had other ways of paying taxes. Herod was an evil king. Well, Herod was an evil king. That's true.
Yeah, it was not nice.
If I told you that Jesus was a child of rape, would you still serve him? Well, he's not a child of rape, so I'm not sure why that is even important.
Right.
Can you imagine a world without Jesus? The answer is no. I don't. I think we can imagine a world without Jesus.
Yeah.
We had it in the first century already.
Which
Right.
one?
What
Yeah,
if
we
Jesus
did.
had never been born?
I don't remember.
So we read a book, I can't remember the name of it. I wish I could right now, but it was about how the Judeo-Christian worldview has shaped the West and basically really formed our world history, modern history.
Right. Tom Holland's book Dominion. I read one 20 years earlier than that by a Lutheran pastor under the influence of Christianity Transformed Civilization. There's been several that have done good work. The one that's interesting about Tom Holland is he's an atheist. He's still an atheist. Although he's attending church, he's still an atheist. He wrote that book because he was a historian, and he wanted to understand why Christianity's been so powerful. And so as he did that, he came to realize that without Christianity, we wouldn't have Western civilization. Now, his book is interesting because it does not paint it all rosy and good and all of that. He shows the church in all of its good and a lot of its bad. And it has had both down through the ages. Not because... Yeah, go ahead.
D. James Kennedy,
Oh,
What
yeah.
If Jesus Had Never Been Born is the book that we read. It's very, very good. And it's basically just saying exactly what Dawn is sharing, except from this guy is a believer, I believe.
Yeah.
I believe.
I believe it.
So,
Yeah, he passed away some years
so you get
ago.
an atheist view and you get a Christian's view.
I would also like to just comment on that thing about would you still serve Jesus as he is a child of rape or something like that? First of all, if you read Luke, Mary's actually very happy that that she's carrying Jesus. Most rape victims, I don't think, are very happy to learn that they're pregnant because of their rape, because the person who raped them got them pregnant. And secondly, a lot of monarchies across the world have a lot of the kings have been children of rape or some sort of whatever.
Incest, yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, if you believe that, would you still serve someone who's a child of incest? Rape, it doesn't matter where they came from. Are they still a good person? Are they still a just person? This is called the genetic fallacy.
Right.
If it were true.
If it were true.
Right. So how they came to be is not relevant in whether they have worth or whether you would father them or whatever. Because they have no control over that.
Right.
So, okay.
Oh, and one more thing. If you want to ditch the Old Testament and just ditch the New Testament and just go Old Testament, you can look at all the different prophecies about Jesus and his birth and him being in Egypt. Why would he have to flee? It was prophetic. So, I mean, it depends on what you want to believe, if you want to look at that at all. But Old Testament, it was prophesied where he would be born, how that would come about, and it's pretty cool that it actually happened that way. So
Dan, he's a baby. How can a baby fight against a bunch of armed soldiers?
Well, one of the things that they do mention here that we as a group we tend to keep coming back to, and that is, in many ways, this is an apologetic endeavor.
Right.
Whether you're meeting with someone who is not a believer and was raised in a non-believing environment, or you're meeting someone who's deconstructing, the task is still pretty much the same. It is up to us. It is when we need to be trained to do this, and churches need to do the training, to answer the basic questions about the faith.
Mhm.
How do we know the Bible's reliable? How do we know the Bible's inspired? How do we know Jesus is who he claimed to be? How do we know the resurrection is true? Pseudo history, for example, says that God was in flesh all the way from the beginning, but we have no evidence of that.
Mhm.
Uh, and so that would not be a belief that we would salute. It's not in Scripture, certainly. That he may have manifested himself from time to time for various reasons is not the same as incarnating in the flesh in the way that Jesus did. Faith isn't dependent on miracles or prophecy or resurrection is absolutely true. That's what they're saying. But that doesn't mean that they aren't helpful in clearing the way to believe. We don't believe because of miracles, but they do clear away the objections to belief.
Mhm.
And that's the purpose of it. Um, you're not going to argue anybody into the faith. You're just not.
No.
The Jan Moskowitz said, and he was my friend, and I think he's right on this. He would stand up in front of our apologetics conferences, and he would start off saying, "I don't like apologists," which gets everyone's attention because you're in a room of apologists.
Hmm.
And he says because they think that if they give the right information, someone will believe. But belief is not a function of information. It is a decision of the faith. It's an act of the will.
Act of the will.
We choose to believe.
Right.
And so it isn't dependent on a miracle or dependent on prophecy or dependent on resurrection. That's true. But those things clear the path of objection, and then you can choose to believe or choose to not believe. It's an
Right.
act of the will.
Right.
I think that's important to note.
Well, faith is dependent on the resurrection.
I'm sorry?
Faith is dependent on the resurrection. You prove the resurrection didn't happen, and I'll stop believing.
No, it's not. It's not dependent on belief in it. Faith isn't, but faith is. You're right. The resurrection is important because that is
It's
part of the.
foundational. It's essential. It either
Absolutely.
happened or didn't. If it didn't happen, we all go home.
Right.
It's
Right.
So to say faith isn't dependent on miracles, it's like, hey, none of the miracles happened. I still believe. No way. It's dependent on truth. I mean, if you can show that it's not true, if you can show that the miracles, none of them happened, then what are we talking about?
Well, what he or she pseudo history said, I'm not saying the resurrection didn't happen. So they're not denying the resurrection happened, which I suspect is what is going on.
Mhm.
But the resurrection, you can have faith without even understanding the aspects of the resurrection yet. Right? We are saved by faith, that's true. And you're saved by faith that the resurrection is true.
Mm-hmm.
But can you begin appropriating faith without understanding the resurrection?
That's
Well, I
That's a
think
tricky question.
Well, yeah. For me, it's a. Go
and
ahead.
believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. That's
Mhm.
that's the definition of faith that is Christian faith. So
Right.
it is absolutely dependent on the resurrection. There's no resurrection, there's no faith.
That's right. Mhm.
And now you may not understand the logical reasoning process that leads from the historical evidence to the conclusion, but that's a separate issue.
Well, see, for me, you're right, but I have a dilemma in my life, and I run into this quite often. How much of the mechanics of the faith must you possess to be saved? Can you be saved without understanding the Trinity?
Mhm.
Sure.
Depends on what you mean by understanding it.
Well, that you can give a reasonable defense of what it is.
I mean, nobody understands it. On the other
No.
hand, if you deny it, then you raise significant questions about whether your faith is Christian faith.
Right.
Mm.
Here's kind of what I came up with, because I had some years back. James may or may not remember this.
Mm.
And an individual had been a Jehovah's Witness for 50 years. He came to faith. And he joined up with another ministry, and he immediately started writing booklets about the
Mm.
faith, which were not great. and
Yeah.
and we would go to the head of the organization, as a friend of mine. I would say, look, you need to disciple this guy, because what he's doing is harmful to the body of Christ.
Sure.
Passionate, I'm glad he is, but it's just a problem. And this went on for a couple of years, and he kept saying, I'm discipling, don't worry about it. And we said, okay. Well, then he came to one of our JW conferences, the head of the ministry, and said, we have to publicly denounce this individual as a heretic.
Yeah.
And we said, why? He said, well, he isn't a true Christian, because when he gave his testimony, he said, I wasn't sure who Jesus was. I didn't know if you're Michael the Archangel or if you're God, but I'm calling on you for salvation. And then almost immediately he revealed himself to me that he was God.
Mm.
And so it started a big brouhaha over that. And
Hmm.
I suggested this. I said, we have an interesting thing in the Gospels where we have individuals who are clearly understanding and denying who Jesus was. That's the Pharisees.
Mhm.
And we have someone else who was a man born blind. And they asked him, they said, who healed you? Well, so and so. Well, and he's a sinner. And he said this, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know, but I know I was blind and now I see. So we have an individual who wasn't rejecting God. He didn't fully understand what was going on. And we have those who fully understand or are fully rejecting. Now, at what point does he cross the bridge of true belief? I don't know that question.
When I came to know Christ a few years ago, I had a similar experience to your friend. I asked God to reveal himself, and he did. And I knew in that moment, even though I had a very rudimentary public school understanding of Christianity, I knew Jesus was real, and I knew I was saved. Without a doubt, I knew these
Mhm.
things. And God provided me with a friend who happened to be a former Navy chaplain, and I was able to talk to him, and he was able to disciple me. Jesus knew I didn't know, and so he provided me with somebody to teach me. About a year later, we ended up meeting Dawn. God takes care of us. I don't doubt, had I died that night when Jesus revealed himself to me, I don't doubt I would have gone to heaven, even though I knew nothing of the faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
Right. So, I mean, there's kind of a dilemma here, because Don is right, obviously. Says by we I'm having one of those moments, Don.
You need more caffeine.
Oh.
No, it's not caffeine. It's we used to on our computers back in the old days. We had to defrag the computers so that they get all the stuff back to where it's
Yeah.
supposed to go,
I remember
so
that.
it can work quicker. Well, we need to be able to do that to our brain, because all the stuff is there. It's just scattered out. We got to defrag our brain
Reorganize.
here.
It's ready for the White
Faith,
House.
yeah, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God.
Yeah, right.
So faith comes in a process of understanding what the word of God says, and it convinces us of the need for salvation. We call on the name of the Lord to be saved, confessing that he is Yahweh, This is Romans 10:9-13.
Mhm.
That God raised him from the dead, so there's a resurrection, and that's what we're confessing. Now, at what point did faith come in that process? Well, you have to come before you actually confessed it. So the resurrection clearly has a play in there, not only in securing our salvation, but in our believing in that the resurrection happened to be saved. So, I don't know. Good discussion. We're over time by 10 minutes.
Hey.
So back to the deconstructing movement. It is important, very important, to think kindly, even if they're deconstructing. It's a scary time for parents. It sure is.
For sure.
But it is also a good time for them to dig in and learn more about why they believe what they believe, so they can ask good questions to those who are deconstructing. That tends to be better because then it's not argumentative. It is a real opportunity to talk back and forth about the issues.
Yep.
Anybody else have anything to say?
No.
Okay, then we're going to pick this up next week with the next chapter.
Oh, and it happens to be faith.
Pardon?
It happens to be titled Faith.
Yeah. Well, how do you like that?
How do you like them apples?
All right. There are superheroes, anti-superheroes, hero victims, and vampires, and true heroes, and no superpowers. And that's, I'm not sure how that's
Neither
relevant
here nor there.
exactly, but it's interesting.
Yes.
See you all later.